Don't worry, class. No one has ever solved this one. It's just for fun. A ripple of indifferent laughter spread through the dull classroom. Mr. Halbrook, the substitute teacher, had just scrawled an equation on the board that the academic world called impossible. The class quickly retreated into their own worlds. Yawns, the clandestine glow of phone screens, and aimless doodles in notebooks. But one boy in the back of the room hadn't looked away. His hands were still grimy from mucking out the cattle stalls that morning. The sleeves of his flannel shirt were rolled past his elbows, and his work boots had left a faint dusting of dirt near his chair. His name was Henry Blake, 14, the son of a cattle farmer from rural Lexington, Nebraska, who sat quietly, staring at the board as if it held a secret. The cover of his notebook was frayed. The pencil in his hand was sharpened down to a stub, and there was a faint stain of hay on the front of his jeans. No one paid him much mind. Paid him much. No one ever had. "This is called Bertrand's impossible problem," Mr. Halbrook continued, turning back to the class. "A mathematician jokingly proposed it as a challenge back in 1954, and it's stuck around in textbooks ever since. No one's ever fully solved it. It's just one of those things that messes with your head. So don't sweat it. It's not for homework." When the bell rang, students shot up from their seats, chattering and flooding into the hallway. Some were still chuckling at the absurdity of the problem. Henry didn't move. "Aren't you heading out, Blake?" Mr. Halbrook asked, zipping up his old, worn leather briefcase. Henry shook his head gently. "Do you mind if I write something down real quick?" The teacher shrugged. "Sure, just don't draw any cartoons on my board." As Mr. Halbrook left, Henry slowly rose and approached the blackboard, but he didn't touch it. Instead, he pulled a battered notebook from his backpack, flipped to the last page, and began to write. He didn't realize how much time had passed until the hallways were silent. Henry folded the page once, then again, and placed it on Mr. Halbrook's desk. No name, no explanation, just a page of markings and margins filled with quiet thoughts. That afternoon, he rode the bus home, hay still clinging to the cuffs of his jeans. As he walked through the back door of their old farmhouse, his mother was kneading bread dough. "Anything interesting at school today, honey?" Henry shrugged. "Not really, just a strange math problem." His mother smiled, dusting the flour from her hands. He went to his room and whispered to himself, "Maybe I'm wrong, but what if I'm right?" The next morning, Mr. Halbrook returned to the classroom with his usual warm coffee from the gas station. He wasn't expecting much. Substitute teachers rarely did. When he found the folded paper on his desk, he almost tossed it in the trash. Probably just another prank, he thought. He took a sip of his coffee, idly unfolded the paper, and stopped mid-sip. There were notes in the margins, annotations in parentheses, a single line connecting two conditions in the equation that no one had ever managed to bridge before. He read it again, slower this time, his eyebrows rising. "No way," he muttered, setting his coffee cup down. It wasn't a prank. The work had a logic of its own. Mr. Halbrook picked up a red pen, carefully tracing the steps the student had laid out. The single line connecting the two parts of the equation, the parts mathematicians had assumed were unrelated, looked strangely sound. The issue wasn't some complex formula. On the contrary, Henry's approach was startlingly simple. The boy hadn't solved the problem in the conventional way. He had simply discarded an assumption everyone had taken for granted for a century. He had broken a rule not by proving it wrong, but by showing it was never needed in the first place. Mr. Halbrook took a deep breath. The thrill of an unexpected discovery washed over him. This wasn't a ninth grader's homework. This was a whole new insight. He picked up his phone, knowing exactly who he needed to call. In the middle of history class, the door flew open. "Henry Blake, the principal wants to see you," another teacher announced. A wave of whispers followed Henry out of the room. Someone muttered, "What's the country boy done now?" Henry tried to ignore it, but his heart started to pound. What did I do wrong? Was it because of that paper I gave Mr. Halbrook? In the principal's office, there was a stranger alongside the principal. He wore a crisp shirt, glasses, and had an intensely focused look. Henry, the principal said, this is Dr. Kerr from the University of Nebraska's mathematics department. Hello, Henry, the man said, extending his hand. Dr. Malcolm Kerr, I'm with the University of Nebraska's math department. Do you mind if we talk for a moment? Henry blinked. Okay, am I in trouble? Dr. Kerr smiled. No, son, on the contrary, I think you've done something very, very right. On this paper, you connected two ideas that no one thought was possible. Where did that come from? Henry fidgeted, feeling small under the doctor's gaze. I just didn't think it was necessary, he explained. A short silence fell. Dr. Kerr stared at Henry for a long moment, then turned to the principal with a look of disbelief. I have a graduate student from MIT, Kerr said, his voice still edged with astonishment. He's been stuck on a similar problem for 6 months. And this kid, he just walked right around it. He turned back to Henry, his gaze no longer probing, but filled with fascination. Henry, he said, his tone warmer now, this Friday we're holding a seminar. I'd like to invite you to the university, just to tour the campus, see what we do, and more importantly, I want my colleagues to meet you. We'll arrange for transportation. The offer hung in the air. For Henry, it was more overwhelming than being called to the principal's office. It was an invitation to a different world, one he was never sure he belonged to. The university car drove Henry through the main wrought iron gates, leaving the dusty roads and familiar fields behind. He had never seen so many buildings made of brick and glass. Everything was clean, polished, and seemed almost terrifyingly organized. The moment he stepped into the main hall of the mathematics department, Henry felt like 100 eyes were on him. The rumor had preceded him, traveling through the corridors faster than a department-wide email. There he is, a voice whispered from a group of students clutching laptops. The farm boy who solved Bertrand's problem. The phrase farm boy hung in the air. Henry instinctively looked down at his clothes. His denim shirt, though his Sunday best, suddenly felt coarse and out of place among the crisp button-downs and tailored blazers. He felt like a strange exhibit, an antique misplaced in a modern art gallery. Dr. Kerr put a reassuring hand on his shoulder, but the attention only intensified. Professors walked by, glancing at him with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. The students weren't so subtle, they pointed and murmured, some with condescending smirks. Henry felt his throat go dry and his palms grow damp. Just then a woman with an air of authority strode toward them. She wore a charcoal gray power suit, her hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and she wore a pair of glasses that seemed to sharpen her already piercing gaze. The ambient noise seemed to quiet as she approached. Dr. Kerr, she said, her voice clear and devoid of any excess emotion. I hear you've brought your new discovery. Bright, Kerr replied, a hint of tension in his voice. I wanted to introduce you. This is Henry Blake. Dr. Evelyn Bright, the head of the department's Mathematical Integrity Division, a title Henry had never heard of and didn't fully understand, except that it sounded terrifying, turned her gaze on him. It was not a welcoming look. Her eyes swept from his unruly hair, down his denim shirt, paused for a fraction of a second on his dusty boots, and then met his. It was a clinical assessment, as cold as a doctor examining a specimen, searching for any sign of flaw or fraud. Mr. Blake, she said, her nod almost imperceptible. She didn't offer her hand. Then she turned and continued down the hall. And under Dr. Bright's watch, he felt his chances of failure had just multiplied. The seminar took place in a tiered lecture hall, the air thick with seriousness and expectation. Dr. Kerr was presenting the key points of Henry's approach, his voice filled with pride. And as you can see, Kerr concluded, removing this constraint doesn't just simplify the equation. It opens up an entirely new path, a path we've overlooked for a century. A hush fell over the room, followed by a low murmur of discussion. A few hands went up. Dr. Kerr pointed to a young man in the third row. He had perfectly coiffed hair, wore an expensive turtleneck sweater, and had a sharp, confident smirk playing on his lips. "Yes, Trevor," Kerr said. Trevor Langford stood, his posture exuding the polished authority of someone who knew he belonged there. "Thank you, Kerr. Fascinating," he began, his voice smooth as silk. "However, I have some reservations about the methodology here. It seems less like a systematic deduction and more like a lucky guess, an intuitive leap. Could Mr. Blake perhaps explain the logical steps that led him to discard such a fundamental constraint?" The question sounded reasonable, but its tone was laced with condescension. All eyes turned to Henry. He felt his face flush. He didn't have logical steps in the way they wanted to hear. It just made sense to him. I I just didn't think it was needed," Henry stammered, his voice barely a whisper, almost swallowed by the vastness of the lecture hall. A soft chuckle came from Trevor. His smirk was no longer polite. It had sharpened to a cutting edge. "Just thought so," Trevor pressed, turning to the audience as if sharing an inside joke. "And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the problem. A flash of insight can be interesting, but it isn't mathematics. Mathematics requires rigor, proof, a solid foundation." He paused, his eyes raking over Henry from head to toe, lingering on his work boots. The disdain in his gaze was palpable. "What I mean is," Trevor said, his voice now dripping with a contempt, "we are at one of the world's premier academic institutions. We don't grade on a curve for how well someone can mend a fence. Ideas here must be built on rigor, not on mud." The last word landed like a stone in the dead silence of the room. Mud. It hung in the air, dirty and heavy. Henry felt as if someone had just punched him in the gut. Every insecurity, every fear about where he came from was now dragged out and exposed before dozens of strangers. He felt cornered, stripped bare, and humiliated. His ears were ringing, and all he wanted was to disappear, to run from the stares of pity, curiosity, and smug satisfaction boring into him. "Trevor, that's enough," Kerr snapped, his face flushing with anger. But before the argument could escalate, a cold, decisive voice cut through it all. It was Dr. Evelyn Bright, who had been observing silently. She stood, not looking at Trevor nor at Henry. She looked directly at the problem. "This debate is unproductive," she declared. "If there is doubt about the validity of the method, we will not settle it with rhetoric." She turned to Henry, her eyes like ice. "We will settle this with mathematics. That's what we do here." She wasn't defending him. She was simply converting a personal humiliation into a public trial. A trial by combat that Henry, in this position, could not refuse. The tension in the room ratcheted up tenfold. This was no longer a seminar. It was an arena. The silence in the lecture hall became suffocating. Dr. Bright watched Henry, waiting. Trevor Langford crossed his arms, a smug grin plastered on his face, certain the farm boy would be speechless. Henry stood up, trembling, his hands clenched into fists. He didn't look at the crowd, but straight at the whiteboard covered in numbers. "You're right," Henry began, his voice quiet but clear. "I don't think in steps, like in the books. I'm not good at that." Trevor scoffed, as if to say, "See?" "Instead," Henry continued, his voice steadier now, "I look at the whole problem and ask, is there a part here that doesn't need to be?" He walked up to the board and picked up a marker. He didn't do any complex calculations. He simply circled a small part of the equation that everyone else had taken for granted. "This part," he said, tapping the marker against the board, "everyone assumes it has to be here. It's always been there in all the papers. But I didn't see how it helped solve anything. In fact, it just made everything more complicated." Trevor started to object, but Henry spoke over him, his voice now full of confidence. It's like a roadblock put in the middle of the street. Everyone tries to find a way around it, but no one asks why it's there in the first place. With that, Henry did something startlingly simple. He wiped away the part of the equation he had just circled with his hand. The change on the board was immediate. The tangled mess of symbols suddenly became neat, clear. A direct link between the two sides of the problem appeared, simple and undeniable. A silence fell over the room, but this time, it was a silence of stunned amazement. Professors and students alike held their breath, staring at the board. The century-old problem had become simple because one person had dared to remove something everyone thought was mandatory. Trevor Langford stood frozen, his face pale. The smug smirk was gone. The boy he had just ridiculed for thinking like a fence mender had used that exact practical mindset to solve a problem the most complex minds had given up on. In that moment, Henry was no longer the farm boy. He was the only person in the room who had dared to ask a question no one else had thought of. Why does it have to be this way? And that question had changed everything. The buzz of the seminar had faded, but its echo still resonated in Henry's mind long after he returned to the familiar air of the farm. 2 days later, as Henry was tinkering with the old carburetor on the tractor, a sleek black sedan, so clean it looked out of place, slowly rolled up the dirt road to his house. A woman in an elegant business suit stepped out. She smiled warmly, a professional yet genuine smile. Henry Blake? I'm Lillian Joe from the Meridian Foundation. Henry, his hands still covered in grease, awkwardly wiped them on a rag hanging from his hip. He and his parents invited her inside. Their modest living room seemed to shrink in the presence of their formal guest. Lillian Joe got straight to the point. She placed a thick, embossed envelope on the table. Following the events at the seminar and a strong recommendation from Dr. Kerr, she said, the Meridian Foundation is honored to offer you a full scholarship to the University of Nebraska. Henry held his breath. His father stopped mid-sip of his tea. His mother brought a hand to her mouth. This scholarship, Lillian continued, covers full tuition, a monthly living stipend, a furnished apartment near campus, and most importantly, you'll have a personal mentor, one of the top professors in the department, to guide you through your studies. Each of her words was like a firework exploding in Henry's mind. Joy. A wave of pure, overwhelming joy swelled in his chest. He had done it. He had been seen, and all the ridicule, all the condescending looks seemed to melt away. He looked over at his parents and saw their eyes shining with a pride and relief he had rarely seen. This was the ticket out of a life of hardship, the answer to all their silent prayers. But as night fell, long after Lillian Joe had left and the house had settled back into its familiar quiet, the euphoria began to subside, giving way to a different feeling. Henry sat in his room, staring at the elegant envelope resting on his old wooden desk. It looked alien, like an artifact from another planet. And then the questions began to creep in, heavy and persistent. He thought of his father, who would have to fix the tractor alone tomorrow. He thought of his mother, who would have to stretch their budget even further without his help. Was it selfish to leave the farm now, to leave them with the burden here while he chased his own dream? He remembered Trevor's face, Dr. Bright's scrutinizing gaze, the whispers about the farm boy. He might have won an argument, but could he live in that world every day? A world of suits, of jargon, of unwritten rules he didn't know. Could he ever fit in, or would he always be the outsider? The biggest worry weighed on his mind. He looked out the window and saw the distant fence that needed mending, the barn roof that was beginning to show signs of rot. The feeling of leaving something unfinished washed over him. The afternoon's joy had now transformed into a burden. The life-changing opportunity he had always dreamed of had suddenly become a crossroads fraught with indecision. In Henry Blake, The boy who had just solved an impossible problem was now completely stuck on the problem of his own life. A few days later, Henry was sitting on the porch steps, the Meridian Foundation envelope beside him, like an object both promising and heavy. He was lost in a tangle of thoughts when the familiar rumble of an old pickup truck sounded on the dirt road. It was Mr. Holbrook, the substitute teacher who had seemingly vanished from his story. He parked, walked over to Henry, and sat down on the step beside him, looking out at the fields in silence for a moment. "I heard about the scholarship," he finally said, his voice low and kind. "Congratulations, Henry. Truly." "Thanks," Henry replied, but his voice lacked any joy. Mr. Halbrook glanced at him with a knowing look. "You don't look much like a boy who just won the lottery." Henry sighed, looking down at his boots. "It's complicated. Leaving now, it feels like I'm leaving everything unfinished." Mr. Halbrook nodded slowly, as if he understood the feeling exactly. "I get it," he said, and there was something in his voice that made Henry look up. "I've seen that look before, in a mirror, a long, long time ago." Henry looked at him, confused. And then the substitute teacher shared a secret he had kept for nearly 40 years. "When I was your age, Henry, I was obsessed," he began, his voice dropping, almost a confession. "Not with homework, but with problems like Bertrand's, the unsolved ones. I stayed up all night, filling notebooks, trying to find paths no one else could see." His gaze grew distant, returning to a past Henry couldn't imagine. "I thought I could do something special." "So, why didn't you?" Henry asked, almost in a whisper. A sad smile touched Mr. Halbrook's face. "Life, Henry. My father got sick. The farm needed help. Back then, there weren't foundations like Meridian seeking out kids in the countryside. There were no Dr. Kerrs willing to listen. My world was a lot smaller than yours is now." He paused, and here came the most painful admission. Eventually, the notebooks got put away. He turned to look directly at Henry, and for the first time, Henry saw a profound regret in his teacher's eyes. "When I read your paper, Henry, it was like hearing an echo from the past. Only your voice was clearer, stronger. You didn't just solve a problem. You finished a job I started and gave up on." Mr. Halbrook placed a calloused hand on Henry's shoulder, a grip that was firm and full of meaning. "Advice from an old substitute teacher isn't worth much," he said, "but don't let that voice in your head go quiet. Don't let it get buried under worries about a leaky roof or a broken fence." Mr. Halbrook's confession was like a key, unlocking the door that had blocked Henry's path. It brought a new source of motivation, a steadiness that replaced the fear. The decision was now clearer than ever. The air in the Blake's small kitchen seemed warmer than usual. His parents sat across from him, waiting silently. They had seen the change in their son's eyes when he came back in from the porch. Henry took a deep breath, then pushed the envelope toward his father. "I think we should call them back," he said, his voice steady and without a trace of hesitation. "I'm going." His mother couldn't help but cry, but they were tears of pride. His father, a man of few words, simply gave a solemn nod, but his eyes shone with a deep joy. Henry's hardest problem was finally solved. The day he left, the sky was clear and the air carried the scent of damp earth after a night of rain. The familiar black sedan was parked in front of the house again, but this time it no longer seemed alien. It was a bridge. Henry carried his backpack out, filled with a few changes of clothes, some new books, and a lot of empty space for whatever was to come. He wasn't leaving to escape the farm. He was taking it with him. He carried the practical mindset that had allowed him to see through a problem, the persistence honed by failed harvests, and the love of his family as his foundation. As he was about to get into the car, his father called out, "Wait, Henry." He walked over holding something heavy, wrapped in an old rag. He said nothing, just quietly unwrapped it. Inside was a large steel wrench, its body worn and stained with the grease of time. It sat heavy in his father's palm. "This was your grandfather's," his father said, his voice low and rustic. He placed the wrench in Henry's hand. The weight of it was surprising. "Since I was a boy, I watched him use this to fix nearly everything here. The water pump, the tractor, the fences. It kept this farm running." Henry looked at the wrench, then up at his father, not quite understanding. His father put a hand on his son's shoulder, a squeeze full of trust. "You go," he said, his gaze meeting Henry's, holding everything he couldn't say with words. "And fix something bigger somewhere else." In that moment, Henry understood everything. His father wasn't handing him a tool. He was giving him his blessing, his permission. He wasn't abandoning his roots or forgetting how to fix things. He was just taking that skill where it was needed more to solve bigger problems. He hugged his father, a tight, solid hug. Henry got into the car. He carefully placed his grandfather's old wrench in his backpack, right next to the brand new advanced mathematics textbooks. The two objects, one a symbol of his past and one of his future, lay side by side in perfect harmony. The car started to move, leaving the familiar dirt road behind. Through the window, Henry saw his parents standing on the porch, growing smaller until they disappeared behind the line of trees. He didn't look back again. He turned his head forward toward the long stretch of highway where a new world awaited. The farm boy hadn't been left behind. He was right here, carrying the whole farm in his heart, ready to reshape the way the world thought, one problem at a time.